Correspondent Charlotte Bellis is in Kabul and she headed for the airport very soon after the attack, and she describes what she saw.
We initially heard the first explosion around 5:40 p.m. We headed towards the scene and there was chaos, as you can imagine. There was a lot of gunfire as the Taliban tried to push people away and control the scene. We tried to move closer towards Abbey Gate. We heard another explosion. There was more heavy gunfire. There was hundreds of people running towards us, and there was heavy smoke in the air. We heard sirens coming from the airport, and the Taliban fighters that guard that south gate where we had arrived were pushing everyone back quite frantically. They were panicked themselves. A few ambulances drove past us, and we stayed there for about half an hour, and heavy gunfire continued throughout. We've tried to talk to US military forces over this time, but they are keeping quite quiet about their operations. But we do know that 3 US soldiers were injured, and I was just down there earlier this week at this exact location at Abbey Gate. And the Taliban don't let you film around the airport's perimeter, so I used my phone to film and capture some of what was happening. There were hundreds of people around Abbey Gate. This was just a couple of days ago. There were Taliban checkpoints around there, and then there's a post with 3 Americans in it at that time that were overlooking the scene at the top of about a 3-meter high concrete wall surrounded by barbed wire, and they were overlooking the hundreds of people trying to get through. People below them were waving pieces of paper saying, you know, I deserve to get on some of these flights. Here's my certificate from working with the Americans and what have you. And they had the gate closed at that time, just overlooking the scene. We heard of an ISIL threat earlier this week. It didn't seem to deter anybody, but then it was only coming from the US and it was quite vague. Over the last 24 hours or so, there were more threats issued by various countries talking about this ISIL threat. I contacted the Taliban this morning to ask if they knew any more details about, have any more intelligence on it. They said, from what we understand, ISIL is planning some type of car bombing in and around the airport, and that they're looking for maximum damage. After we received that, we decided to stay clear of the airport today, as did other media networks who we had been going down there, all of us, every day, but today most people steered clear because there was the threats level and the amount of information we were getting was getting more credible and coming from more sources. And it was more kind of watch and wait. I do have to say that my producer ducked down there briefly just to have a quick look from a distance, and he said there were far fewer people down there today, that the Taliban were incredibly tense, and that's saying something because they've been tense all week, but very much pushing people back, trying to keep them at a distance from the airport, and were quite agitated when he got down there and they told him to leave immediately. So everyone was on alert today, but at Abbey Gate it appears that there had been crowds forming and that they hadn't managed to disperse them when this explosion occurred.
Well, let's now cross back to Washington, D.C. and speak to Alan Fisher. He has all the latest lines for us out of the Pentagon. Alan, we are hearing confirmation that 4 Marines were killed in this attack. What more do we know?
That information was given to staff at the US Embassy in Kabul by the ambassador. He confirmed that 4 Marines had been killed, 3 had been injured. Certainly, the Pentagon has, in the last 20 minutes, put out a statement confirming that there have been a number of American casualties, and we should get more details on that when the Pentagon is due to brief in about 90 minutes' time. Certainly, 24 hours ago, because they were aware of this threat that had been made by ISIL, that there was the potential for an attack at the airport, the Marines on duty there had been given advice on what to look for a potential suicide bomber. Even with that, they continued to process people through the gates. They're trying to get them on flights and get them out of Afghanistan. But interestingly enough, the numbers over the last 24 hours dipped quite significantly from the numbers that they've been doing since the start of the week. That may have been because of more security checks. That, at the moment, is just mere speculation, but something, obviously, that the Americans will want to look at. We know that Lloyd Austin, who is the Defence Secretary, has been with Joe Biden. He was in the Situation Room at the White House. They were talking to commanders on the ground. Also there was Antony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State. and then Lloyd Austin went back to the Pentagon. They will be looking at how they carry out operations from now on in. Certainly 24 hours ago, the Pentagon was saying that there was the potential that troops may well be used in Kabul itself to go and get Americans who are stranded. Given that the information coming from the embassy in Kabul is for Americans to stay away from the airport, stay away from the gates, because they were aware that this potential attack could actually happen, it means that that is more likely to be the way that the US conduct their operations from now on in. Certainly, Joe Biden had asked for contingency plans if this operation were to extend beyond the 31st of August. It's a fluid situation. Contingency plans continue to be updated, and we can guess that that's exactly what's happening at the moment.
Alan Fisher there with the latest lines for us out of Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Alan. Well, let's now bring in Marwan Bishara. He's Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, and he joins us now from Paris. As we were hearing there from Alan, Marwan, these confirmations of deaths amongst US troops in these attacks in Kabul, surely that only increases the pressure on President Joe Biden after what's been really a rather humiliating week and a half.
Absolutely. As we were speaking earlier, the next 7-8 days will prove to be the longest in the life of this 78-year-old president. It will also be some of the longest days for many Afghanis and Americans and so on and so forth. These are really testing times. Clearly, 20-year war did not go down very well. But also, as you and I were speaking, certainly Joe Biden and his administration and his intelligence community bear some of the blame, certainly on the operational level and some of the strategizing going forward in terms of withdrawing. But just to make it clear, this deal, the deal for withdrawing American forces from Afghanistan, was signed by President Trump. The short-sightedness, the disaster of this recent thing started with the idea that America will negotiate with the Taliban and the Taliban alone, without bringing in the Afghan government, the other Afghan factions, and certainly without bringing any of the neighboring countries. So what you had in the process of the negotiations with the Taliban is totally legitimizing the Taliban. And as I've written at the time, it looked like surrendering Afghanistan to the Taliban. So Biden really is now inheriting a certain crisis that was brought about by his predecessor, President Trump. And just to add a bit to that and to remind our viewers around the world in a few seconds, that this has been a long, long time coming, 20 years. You know, this started as a war of revenge, avenging the 9/11 attacks. Wars of revenge are never a good idea. They're not credible, they're not legitimate, and they don't work. And then it was followed by another war of choice against Iraq. And when both wars were finished, they decided not to withdraw and leave the Middle East or withdraw their troops. They decided they wanted to change the Middle East. You know, the idea of a crusade by the West on the top of the military to change the Muslim world is not exactly a good idea. And that does inflame hatred, does empower insurgencies, whether it is in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we've seen that happen. And we've seen counterinsurgency growing. We saw the Taliban power growing. And we saw all the possible solution, from the idea of clear, build, and hold, and the idea of the AFPAC and this and that and the other, training the locals, and none of that worked. But the Pentagon continued, as now we know from American press reports, that they continued to lie about it. They kept on saying it was working, they were succeeding, but in fact they were failing. So Biden today is dealing with a catastrophe that has been in the making for some 20 years now.
Marwan, you talk there about this war of revenge in the aftermath of 9/11. How significant is the attacks today? And I ask you this because a lot of this was about, well, the groups that the Taliban was harboring in Afghanistan. And now if the Taliban is proving that they can't necessarily prevent attacks like this from taking place, and that there are other groups who could be operating in and around that area, does that change the political calculus and the military calculus going forward here for Western powers?
You know, your question is, it really presents very well the paradox of this whole crisis, this whole blunder, this whole debacle. Because what do you have here? What do we have today? What we have a situation is after 20 years and 4 American presidents, they got rid of the Taliban in order to replace them with the Taliban. It took 20 years and 4 presidents to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. A Taliban today that is far more powerful than the Taliban of 1996 or 2001. So clearly, these are the marks of this disastrous war, this war of revenge, as it were, that they continued to lie about it. And yes, in the process, what we have today is not only Al-Qaeda, we have Al-Qaeda, we have the Taliban, and we have ISIL. And as we've seen in Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, and elsewhere in Africa and Asia, ISIL turned out to be even more vicious than Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So clearly, the situation now does not bode well for this 20-year experience. And clearly, this is the time, once the next 7-8 days are gone by, to draw the lessons. And what are these lessons? Clearly, Joe Biden has proven to be smarter than the rest in the sense he's saying, look, we need to end the never-ending wars, period. And we need to stick to some of the deadlines, period. And we cannot go back and fight. And even today, the Israeli Prime Minister in Washington was going to be there nagging and demanding that the United States stay and hold the fort against Iran and drop the diplomacy in favor of what? The United States does not want to go into another war in the Middle East. So that's at least that one lesson seems, for the time being, to have been learned. That the idea of conventional wars, the idea of counterinsurgency does not serve American interests and does not end terrorism. But that takes us just quickly to this another paradox of this whole thing. So while the Biden administration decided to stop all efforts of counterinsurgency and conventional war and deployment of troops on the ground, it is sticking to the idea of the war on terror, meaning not counterinsurgency, but combating terror, meaning not doing it physically on the ground with American troops, but doing it by drones, missiles, special operation, and so on and so forth. To my mind, that will create more of the same hatred, more of the same animosity, and more of the same extremism and radicalization in the Arab and Muslim world. So while counterinsurgency on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere was not a good idea, but also the idea of war on terror throughout the Muslim world using drones and special operation will also prove to be inflaming the souls in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere in the Muslim world. So that's lesson number 2, meaning you're going to have to find a better way of how to deal with the question of terrorism in a way that is more in partnership with some of the countries in the region, more through diplomacy and development and less through war and violence.
Marwan Bishara there, Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, speaking to us from Paris. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us again, Marwan. Thanks for being with us. Well, let's now move over and speak to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, as Marwan was alluding to there, President Biden was supposed to be meeting the Israeli Prime Minister today, but that hasn't happened, and he's ended up spending most of his day in the Situation Room instead.
We know that the president is getting regular updates, and so we expect that that is happening in the Situation Room, because in terms of how the president is getting this information, it is coming through very secure and classified channels, and that is the only place in the White House where that can be assured. So we know earlier today that the U.S. president and commander-in-chief of the U.S. military, as he is also known, was meeting in the Situation Room with the defense secretary, the secretary of state, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, as well as the vice president, who is flying back from a tour in Asia, but participated virtually from Air Force 2. Now, what we know is that much of the intelligence following these explosions was being shared in real time with these intelligence officials and security officials, and they were coordinating with the commanders on the ground. Now, we do know that in the case of Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, that he is now back at the Pentagon, but we expect that some of those briefings are continuing with high-level senior administration officials. So what the White House is confirming for us is that the president's schedule has changed so that he can continue to get these briefings. And so what that means, what isn't happening, is that there is no longer a White House press secretary briefing with the White House press secretary Jen Psaki. The planned bilateral meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett as well as U.S. President Joe Biden has been delayed. We don't know if that will happen today. I suspect not, but we've had no word on when that is being rescheduled. In fact, most of the Israeli media has now left the White House campus and is either congregating at the Willard Hotel or at other locations. And we can also tell you that the virtual meeting between the U.S. president and some governors around the United States, these would be the heads of some of the states that have offered to house some of the Afghans who have been evacuated, that has been canceled for now. So what we are expecting is to get some sort of update about when we will hear from the U.S. president, because the big question and the pressure is growing on him with respect to the August 31st withdrawal date for U.S. troops. The U.S. president had been holding firm on that date, but he said that that was contingent on the Taliban ensuring that there was safe passage to and from the Kabul airport so the evacuations could continue. We know that the State Department halted those evacuations, urging people not to go to the airport because of concerns of an imminent threat of an attack. And then these twin explosions occurring at the Abbey Gate and Kabul airport and also the Barron Hotel. So as a result, there has been a lot of criticism on the U.S. president about the handling of this situation. And that's why we're watching very carefully to hear from the U.S. president.
Indeed. Kimberly, the Taliban is saying that this attack only happened because of the presence of foreign forces on the ground, and they're saying it also took place in an area which was actually controlled by the U.S., by their security forces. And now there are obviously 4 dead Marines who were killed in these blasts. Does that change the political calculus when it comes to withdrawal?
What it changes is the political narrative, because what we have is a bit of a PR war that is being waged between the Taliban and high-level Americans, including the most prominent senator on the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, who's been very critical of the Taliban. In fact, he released a statement condemning these attacks and blaming the Taliban for them occurring, given the fact that it was the U.S.'s understanding that the Taliban was making sure to and from the airport would be secured from any sort of imminent danger. He says, as we may wait for more details, one thing is clear: we can't trust the Taliban with American security. This is a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. I can also tell you the president's Republican critics on Capitol Hill are also very, very unhappy, seething as a result of the news of these attacks and the deaths of at least 4 Americans. One Republican congresswoman accusing the president of having blood on his hands. Another, a veteran of the U.S. military, Representative Dan Crenshaw, saying we are still at war, accusing President Biden, saying you didn't end the war, you just gave the enemy the new advantage. And he is urging the president to go on the offense. That is certainly something that potentially the president is considering, as the Pentagon has drawn up contingency plans. We also know that another prominent senator who has been more hawkish with respect to military issues, Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican, has said that I urge the Biden administration to reestablish our presence at Bagram as an alternative to Kabul airport. And you'll remember just a few weeks back that the U.S. military very quickly and quietly left Bagram and desolate, given the fact that they abandoned it to shift the operations to Kabul airport. So at least one Republican saying that that needs to be rethought. Whether or not that's even an option is really for the military experts to answer. But these are all the unanswered questions that remain. And so that is why all the focus now is on the president's schedule. And we have not yet had any updates. But what I can tell you is that all week, things have been rapidly changing. Briefings have been canceled, delayed, and today is no exception in light of these twin explosions.
Kimberly Halkett there, our White House correspondent in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, Kimberly. Well, let's remind you where this all took place. These twin attacks happened as large crowds tried to reach Kabul airport in order to have a chance of boarding a flight out of Afghanistan. That first attack took place at the Barron Hotel. Have a look down here. People who were hoping to be evacuated had been congregating there. And then a suicide bomber struck the airport's Abbey Gate. Crowds still appear to be ignoring the warnings to stay away, though. Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is saying that their evacuations will continue despite these explosions near the Kabul airport.
There's been a barbaric terrorist attack, what looks like a series of attacks in Kabul on the airport, on the crowds at the airport, in which members of the US military, very sadly, have lost their lives, and many Afghan casualties as well. And we extend our condolences both to the United States of America and to the people of Afghanistan. And I want to stress that this threat of a terrorist attack is one of the constraints that we've been operating under in Operation Pitting, in the big extraction that's been going on. And we've been ready for it, we've been prepared for it. And I want to stress that we're going to continue with that operation, and we're now coming towards the end of it, to the very end of it, in any event. And we've already extracted the overwhelming majority of those under both the schemes, the eligible persons, the UK persons, UK nationals, plus the Afghans, the interpreters, and others. And it's been a totally phenomenal effort by the UK. There's been nothing like it for decades and decades. But clearly, what this attack shows is the importance of continuing that work in as fast and as efficient a manner as possible in the hours that remain to us, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, earlier I spoke to Rosella Miccio. She's the president of Emergency. That's a medical NGO that's treating victims of the blast in Kabul. And she told me that her organisation is still prepared to treat even more patients.
Well, at her seeing the usual disaster of war, we have received more than 60 patients now and 6 dead on arrival. So the impact of this blast has been huge. All of them civilians, and they keep coming. So we don't know exactly how big will be the number, the influx of patients. We work there since 22 years, and we have faced a lot of mass casualties. So we do have plans, we do have extra beds. The hospital was 80% full, but we're adding beds on top of what we already had. Then, of course, once we do the triage, we will keep the more severe cases, the life-threatening conditions, and we'll try to refer the less severe cases, even though in these days there are not so many hospitals fully working in Kabul, unfortunately. It did not change. Our admission criteria just slightly open to also road traffic accidents, civilian traumas, because we started to receive in the last couple of weeks a reduced number of war wounded or war injuries. But generally speaking, we have been keeping both the three hospitals and the 40 clinics always up and running. All our staff is coming, both male and female, has been able to come far. So we hope to be able to continue our work also in the future. Well, to protect, not really, to get ready. It's what we try to do. Our hospital's been there for a very long time, and they've been assisting everybody, regardless their political affiliation. So it is our neutrality has been, let's say, our insurance since the very beginning, and so far it has been always respected. So what we do when we hear about these kind of threats is try and understand how to get ready inside the hospital to receive the massive influx of patients as we are seeing today. We have been in contact with the new, let's say, authorities in Kabul. They hosted also a health cluster meeting to introduce the focal points. But so far, we didn't have any, let's say, interference or any special request. We have been able to keep on doing our job as regularly as we did before. None of them has been taken to our hospital because we check everybody, so not only civilians but also combatants. But at the moment, as far as we know, all the injured patients referred to our hospitals are civilians. Some others, because I think that there are more than this, might have been taken to other facilities. But they are very complex injuries because shells and the fragments they produce multiple injuries. So we receive people with multiple traumas, legs, arms, face, belly. Particularly serious are the vascular injuries because they can lead to a very sudden death. So in this moment, what is very important is to do a very good triage. And of course, the triage has to go on and on continuously because the patients have to be reevaluated. So it's definitely a very stressful moment for the hospital staff.
Well, if you are just joining us here on Al Jazeera, let's remind you of what's been happening. There have been 2 explosions outside Kabul airport. The Taliban is saying at least 13 people have been killed, many more injured. But medical sources are saying that the number of dead could be as high as 25. Meanwhile, the United States has said 4 of their Marines have been killed, 3 others are injured. And this all has happened after the United States, Australia and the UK all warned people to stay away from that area around the airport because of what they were calling an imminent threat from an ISIL offshoot in Afghanistan. Now, thousands, though, continued gathering outside the airport. They'd been there for days in hopes of fleeing the country after the Taliban took over. Well, witnesses to the attacks have been describing what they saw when those explosions went off.
It was time for the evening prayer when an explosion happened. I saw about 70 vehicles carried around 150 injured to the hospital.
People were standing at the airport gate for evacuation when the blast happened. My cousin was also wounded on his leg, so he brought him to the hospital.
Well, the Taliban has condemned the blasts. Their spokesman tweeted, and I quote, "The Islamic Emirate strongly condemns the bombing targeting civilians at Kabul airport." The explosion took place in an area where U.S. forces are responsible for security. Well, let's take you now to a live shot. This is the White House briefing room where the press conference that was due to take place has not indeed happened. We'll be bringing you that live as and when it does.
This is Al Jazeera.